I ended the last lecture with the claim that we oftentimes deploy the counterexample method to evaluate the goodness or badness of arguments on a pretty regular basis in our ordinary experiences. Now, you may have been skeptical of that claim, so let me give you an example from my own life that illustrates this, and then we'll talk about the counterexample method in more detail. When I first started college and I was taking my first philosophy classes, I remember I was sitting around with some friends, and one of my friends gave an argument to the effect that there are no true universal statements. And I remember thinking to myself, no, this argument can't be a good argument. Its conclusion has to be true. But that statement, there are no true universal statements, that statement is a universal statement. It says something universally about every instance of universal statements, namely that they're false. And so if this argument works, then it establishes the truth of that statement. There are no true universal statements, which then establishes that that statement is false. So this can be a good argument. Now, I had this counterexample and I was all excited. I don't think it did much for my relationships with my friends at the time, but it does illustrate how organically counterexamples can emerge when we think about arguments and whether or not the truth of the premises in fact acts to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. And this is the heart of the counterexample method. If we already use the counterexample method on a regular basis in our ordinary experience in order to evaluate the goodness or badness of arguments that we encounter, you might be wondering, well, why then are we bothering to talk about it in lecture? And thanks to our inferences lecture, we're in a good position to answer that question. Our native deductive inferential capacities are highly driven by the content and the context information regarding a deductive argument. And it makes us relatively insensitive to the underlying structural relationships between content elements in that same argument. Now, we've seen that it's the interplay between underlying structural relationships and the content of a particular argument that will make it ultimately successful or unsuccessful in establishing its conclusion. And so in many circumstances in our regular everyday inferential life, we find that the content of an argument obscures our ability to evaluate its underlying structural relationships, and therefore we're not capable of really coming up with a good estimation of its quality. For instance, we might be unduly influenced by belief bias, the believability of the conclusion or the unbelievability of the conclusion exerts a disproportionate influence on our estimation of the overall quality of the argument, because our system 1 deductive inference capacity is still limited by the amount and complexity of information that we can process in our working memory. We can easily become overwhelmed with the content of an argument and unable to do a very good job of systematically evaluating those underlying relationships between content elements. The counterexample method, when we deploy it thoughtfully and systematically, can provide a countermeasure to these difficulties. It can allow us to become more sensitive to the underlying structural features and to come up with a more balanced evaluation of the efficacy of a given deductive argument. Now, our counterexample method applies only to deductive arguments, and it only really helps us to see when the deductive argument is bad. It won't allow us to show that a deductive argument is valid, but it will allow us to detect and to demonstrate that a deductive argument is invalid. And so how do we do that? Well, we're going to start off by learning how to strip the content away from a given deductive argument in order to render its underlying structural relationships explicit. So once we've got those underlying structural relationships explicitly represented for us, the content is gone, but any instance of that argument with any content that we substitute in a systematic fashion will be another instance of the same argument, the same logical form, just different content. And so we'll take that underlying logical structure and we'll put in new content. And we'll do this in a way that helps us to generate examples in the case of invalid arguments that just starkly illustrate, using the content of the new argument, that it's possible for the argument's premises to be true without guaranteeing that the conclusion is true. We'll create what's called a substitution instance, whereby we keep the same structural relationships between content elements, but we introduce new content so that it's clear and obvious to anyone that the premises of this version of the argument are absolutely guaranteed to be true, and the conclusion of this version of the argument is clearly and obviously false, so that we have this demonstration that the truth of the premises doesn't guarantee the truth of the conclusion, and this demonstration is done using content so that we're not shielded from appreciating it by the limitations of our System 1 inference capacities. And we can then conclude that since the argument has the same underlying structural relationships, but this instance of it is obviously invalid based upon our assessment of it using its content, that the other version of the argument, the one that we didn't have such a clear insight into, is also going to be invalid. And so it allows us to get at the underlying structural features of the argument, the other component of a successful deductive argument, in a way that can still be accessed by and appreciated by our System 1 inference capacities. And so this is useful for ourselves, but it's particularly useful to demonstrate to other people that the argument is a bad argument. How do we systematically render an argument's form then? Well, we can really approach it using 4 steps. We'll start by putting the argument into the standard form. Premises first, conclusion last, homogeneous language, and so on. Once we have the argument in standard form, then we're going to want to go through and identify those words in the argument that are logical form words that illustrate the structural relationships between the content elements of the argument. The other words then are the content words or phrases, and then we'll finish rendering the argument's form by replacing identical instances of the content words or phrases with uppercase letters, the same letter every time that content word or phrase appears, so that we'll end with the hybrid that has logical form words and capitalized letters indicating content slots in relationship to each other, and that will be the representation of the underlying structural relationships between the content elements in our argument. These rules are, of course, very abstract. So in the next lecture module, we'll go through 2 concrete examples showing how to render the argument's form and then to generate a substitution instance to illustrate the argument's invalidity.